Picture this. A general stands at the foot of the towering Alps, the tallest mountains in Europe, staring into the abyss of snow and ice. Behind him, 30,000 soldiers shiver in the cold, while 37 war elephants, creatures no army had ever thought possible to march into battle, wait for his command. The path ahead is treacherous, death looms over every step, and yet Hannibal Barca is ready. He has no choice but to succeed. The fate of his home, Carthage, hangs in the balance. What kind of man would take on a task so impossible, so dangerous, that it would echo through history for over 2,000 years? Hannibal's decision to cross the Alps wasn't just a risky move. It was a calculated stroke of genius, one that would take Rome completely by surprise and change the course of history forever. In this video, we'll unravel the incredible story of how one man led his army across the most dangerous mountains in Europe and emerged on the other side to challenge the mighty Roman Republic. But before we dive into the treacherous journey, let's take a step back. Why the Alps? What made Hannibal take this almost suicidal gamble when there were safer, easier routes available? Hannibal wasn't just a general, he was a master of strategy. Born into a family of warriors, his father, Hannibal Barca, instilled in him a burning hatred for Rome from a young age. By the time Hannibal took command of Carthaginian forces in the Second Punic War, he knew that conventional tactics wouldn't be enough to defeat the Roman superpower. Rome's military machine was vast, disciplined, and unbreakable. To win, Hannibal had to do the unthinkable. Did you know that Rome's military was spread thin across the Mediterranean, fully expecting Hannibal to attack from the sea? Their defenses were strongest along the coastline. But Hannibal had other plans. He knew that if he could outflank Rome, strike from the north, and attack them where they least expected, he could throw their entire military into disarray. Hannibal wasn't just gambling with the lives of his men, he was betting on the power of surprise. By choosing the Alps, he transformed the mountains into his greatest ally, an insurmountable obstacle that would shield him from detection and strike fear into the hearts of his enemies. While Roman generals fortified their southern defenses and prepared for a sea battle, Hannibal and his army were already deep within the mountains, facing dangers no one had ever anticipated. Among Hannibal's forces were his most feared weapons, 37 war elephants. These towering giants, sometimes referred to as the tanks of the ancient world, were more than just animals. They were a symbol of terror, strength, and dominance. Standing up to 11 feet tall, weighing over 5 tons, and with tusks capable of impaling enemies, they were Hannibal's secret weapon, designed to shock and awe the Roman forces. But while elephants were fearsome on the battlefield, they were also incredibly difficult to manage. Feeding and transporting these massive creatures through the icy, treacherous passes of the Alps seemed like an impossible task. For the Romans, these elephants weren't just physical threats, they were psychological weapons. Imagine facing an army that had just survived the impossible, led by creatures you'd only heard about in legends. The sight of elephants marching out of the Alps would have been enough to shake even the bravest soldiers. But Hannibal knew the risks. The journey ahead would be brutal, not just for his men, but for the elephants too. Many doubted they would make it, but Hannibal's determination to use them as his trump card drove him forward. The Alps stand as one of the world's most formidable natural barriers, with peaks reaching heights of over 15,000 feet. Snowstorms, freezing winds, avalanches and narrow, treacherous paths awaited Hannibal's army at every turn. Each step forward was a battle against nature itself. It's estimated that Hannibal's army was reduced by nearly half during the crossing. Out of 50,000 soldiers, only 26,000 made it through alive. And yet, Hannibal pressed on. The conditions were beyond brutal. Men fell to their deaths as they slipped from narrow ledges. Supplies dwindled as the days stretched on, and the freezing temperatures claimed more lives each night. Hannibal's men faced starvation, exhaustion, and despair, but they continued forward, driven by their leader's unyielding will. For Hannibal, This was more than just a military maneuver. It was a test of endurance, both for his soldiers and for himself. Every step they took deeper into the Alps was a step closer to survival, but also a step further into the unknown. They had no idea what awaited them on the other side, but even with the staggering losses, Hannibal's army persevered. And after weeks of suffering, they finally emerged from the mountains, scarred, battle-worn and diminished in number, but victorious in spirit. Hannibal had conquered the Alps. When Hannibal and his army descended from the Alps into the fertile lands of Italy, it wasn't just a physical victory, it was a psychological one. Rome, the greatest military power in the world, had never expected to see an enemy emerge from the north, and certainly not one that had just survived the deadliest mountain crossing in history. For the first time, Rome was vulnerable. Hannibal had achieved the impossible. His army, battered and reduced, stood on the doorstep of the Roman Republic, ready for war. The sight of Hannibal's war elephants marching out of the Alps struck fear into the hearts of Roman soldiers. These animals, hardened by the journey, symbolized the strength and resilience of Hannibal's army. They weren't just facing men, they were facing legends. While Roman legions were positioned to defend the southern coasts, Hannibal's unexpected arrival in the north threw them into chaos. He had flipped the script, turning the might of Rome against itself. His journey over the Alps wasn't just a route, it was a declaration that Rome could be outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and outlasted. Hannibal didn't need to strike the first blow. The psychological damage had already been done. Rome, for the first time in its history, was on the defensive, and they knew that their greatest challenge had only just begun. Despite the triumph, the cost of crossing the Alps was staggering. Hannibal had lost nearly half his army, and many of his prized war elephants didn't survive the journey. But for Hannibal, the losses were the price of greatness. Out of the 37 elephants that Hannibal had brought with him, only a handful survived the Alps. But these few survivors were enough to strike fear into the heart of Rome. For Hannibal's men, the journey had been a crucible. Those who survived were hardened, resilient, and ready for battle. They had faced death in the mountains and lived to tell the tale. Now they marched toward Rome, knowing that their greatest challenge was still ahead. Hannibal knew that the crossing had cost him dearly, but the victory wasn't in the numbers. It was in the psychological blow to Rome. The Republic had been shaken, and that for Hannibal was worth every sacrifice. Hannibal's Alpine crossing wasn't just a military maneuver, it became one of the most studied feats in the history of warfare. Military strategists, from Napoleon to modern generals, have looked to Hannibal's journey as an example of how audacity and terrain can turn the tide of war. Hannibal once said, "I will either find a way or make one." His march through the Alps stands as a testament to the power of will, strategy, and the belief that nothing is impossible. From the mountains of Europe to the deserts of Africa, Hannibal's story continues to inspire. His use of surprise, terrain, and psychological warfare redefined what was possible in military history. And even though Hannibal would eventually face defeat, his crossing of the Alps remains one of the boldest, most daring feats in the annals of military history. Hannibal's gamble wasn't just about defeating Rome. It was about proving that the impossible could be achieved. By crossing the Alps, he forever etched his name into the chronicles of history, showing the world that even the mightiest obstacles could be overcome with sheer determination and strategic brilliance. So, what do you think? Was Hannibal's crossing of the Alps the boldest military feat in history? Let us know in the comments below. And if you're fascinated by stories of strategy and defiance, don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories from the past.